This screencast is an explanation of the ITK Acknowledgement Framework. The Acknowledgement Framework information is detailed within the ITK core specification, which is published on TRUD. It can be found under the Interoperability Toolkit folder, and it's this specification here. I've already downloaded it, and this is the index page of the pack, and the ITK core basically covers a number of core areas that are repeatedly used within ITK, irrespective of the business payload which is being carried. For example, an ambulance report or a discharge summary and so on. There are certain aspects of ITK which get reused in each instance, and the acknowledgement framework is something that's linked to the sending of clinical documents. And if you download something like the transfer of care domain message specification of TRUD, you will see references to the requirement that there's an expectation that you can support the acknowledgement framework for both infrastructure acknowledgements and business acknowledgements, and it forms part and parcel of the accreditation profile. So any accredited sending system or receiving system, not only can they send or receive the CDA document, but they can also take part in a number of acknowledgement transactions. And the key reason that we accredit that is as a result of dialogue with the supplier community. It was realised that basically in almost all circumstances there needs to be some form of acknowledgement that a document's been received by the intended recipient, and that B, that there's some mechanism for acknowledging that it's okay from a business perspective. The specifications don't go down to that level of detail where it specifies the logic behind the business acknowledgement, but from the specifications perspective, it's very much about detailing how the capability is implemented. So the ITK core pack acknowledgement framework, as I said, there's an infrastructure acknowledgement and a business acknowledgement. So if we start with the actual CDA document itself, if we have a look at one that we've downloaded as part of the TKW, which is the Toolkit Workbench, which under the contrib directory has a number of test messages, and we look at the transfer of care, we'll see here that there's a number of example messages within there. Just as a point of note, the Toolkit Workbench is available from this URL, systemshscic.gov.uk/SA/tools, and you can download the latest version from here, and this is the site where the latest version is always published. So I've downloaded that and I've extracted TKW and installed it. It's actually a Java executable installer, so I've run that, I've installed it, and we've gone down to this folder, and there are various message examples. So if we open one of these, this is a CDA document which effectively could be sent from a system, so we can see that it's got the SOAP wrapper, so that in actual fact this is one that would be sent over a web service. But if we look at from the distribution envelope layer, which is effectively the layer that's common for all transports, regardless of whether it's sent over a web service, whether it's sent over DTS, whether it's sent over TMS, the distribution envelope is that common element that always exists. You'll see that there's a header section, and under here we've got the handling specification block. Now the handling specification block is intended, as the name would suggest, to explain how a recipient handles the message, and there are a set of key value pairs. One of the keys is the interaction, so that basically states that this is a primary recipient discharge inpatient discharge summary document, and then we've got three other interactions that are related to the acknowledgement framework effectively. Actually two. We've got the infrastructure act requested, and then we've got the ACK requested, which actually refers to the business act. There's actually some legacy reasoning behind why it doesn't say business act, basically because it was the single acknowledgement that was first implemented, so that was the key that was given to it. However, it actually refers to the business acknowledgement. So on receipt of this message and processing this block, you basically see that infrastructure act, yes, it's set to true, so the sender would like an infrastructure act, and the acknowledgement, so that the act requested, which is the business act, is also set to true. So effectively the sender would need to respond with both an infrastructure act and a business act as separate web service calls, or in the case of DTS, two separate distribution envelopes which would be sent back. So if we go back to the core pack, and we have a look in here, well, let's have a look at the infrastructure acknowledgement. So in terms of the construct, it's fairly straightforward. Basically, there are a number of elements that go in there. There's a mechanism to refer to the originating tracking ID. So if we look at this one, always refers back to the tracking ID here within the distribution envelope. So we can reference that and saying that the tracking ID that we're acknowledging, and also the service which is here. So we can reference using those two attributes, they will be populated, and there's also an error info block. So should there be any processing problems around the distribution envelope header, then it would go into this error block here. So that's also the infrastructure acknowledgement is the mechanism, particularly if you're using DTS, for conveying back to the sender any problems with the distribution envelope construct. So it's a fairly straightforward message, and again within the TKW there are acknowledgements in there. So we've got some. Let's have a look. So we've got some acknowledgements here. So here we go. This is an infrastructure ACK. Let's open up. So here we go. Again, this is coming over a SOAP response, but if we were looking at it from a DTS perspective, it would purely be the distribution envelope. Obviously, if it was going over web service, then it would have the complete web service wrapper. But the distribution envelope here has the header that you would expect with any distribution envelope, and then you've got the payload and you've got the infrastructure response. So this is the block of XML that is being described here. So it's this section here under the payloads. So fairly straightforward. So on receipt of a message, it would be sent back. And this block, a distribution envelope, would be sent back to the sending organisation, and this block would be populated to basically inform that the message had been received okay. So that's the Infrastructure Act, fairly straightforward. Again, the pack contains various different examples. The business acknowledgement is slightly more in depth. My link hasn't worked there, unfortunately. Okay, so the ITK Acknowledgement Framework is part of the core pack, it's in there under the associated specifications. So we'll open it up. So here we go. So this is the ITK Business Acknowledgement pack, and here it's got the message definition. So this is it's a HL7 V3 message. So it's got its own arming that basically describes the model and the construct of the message, and basically the business acknowledgement has got two options. So you can either respond to and acknowledge a single complete message, so a complete distribution envelope content, or if the distribution envelope contained multiple payloads, that you could respond to each payload in turn. Now, in relation to sending CDA, in pretty much all cases, it's just a single CDA document within the distribution envelope. So you would be effectively just responding back to the DE. And this is the model. This is where you've got the options of basically responding back. So it allows you to acknowledge under a couple of options. So we've got the message identifier here. So if we go and look at one of the examples in the TKW again. So this is the complete payload block. So that's the business acknowledgement as described by this specification. Yeah, so that's it. Okay, let's open that up. So this is the business acknowledgement, and again, this whole block also gives you the mechanism to include any errors and faults within the business within the business payload itself. So that's the business acknowledgement and the schema. If we look at it in terms of how that maps into the transports, if we look at the web services first of all, effectively we've got a send CDA mechanism. So in this case the services send CDA document. The transfer of care pack has now switched to using the send DE service, so that could very well be the send DE service if it was a transfer of care message, and then effectively it's been processed. If we've selected that we want an infrastructure ACK within the handling specifications, an infrastructure ACK would be sent back, and within there it would reference the original tracking ID. So that tells the sender that the distribution envelope has been received by the intended recipient, and then subsequently, if the handling specifications also requested a business ACK, then the receiving system, we call the host here, can also respond back with a business acknowledgement. And there are two options, as I said. There's one using the tracking ID of the original message, or secondly you could do it on a per payload case. As I previously mentioned, in almost all cases it's this option here where effectively you're just responding back to the tracking ID. And equally, when the business ACK is sent, the business ACK within its handling specifications could also request that they want an infrastructure ACK, so that they know that the intended recipient has effectively got the distribution envelope and at least been able to pass the distribution envelope, so they can get a response coming back. So that's it from a web services perspective. Distribution, if we look at DTS, this diagram, it looks much more complex than it actually is. If we look at the DTS client to DTS client, this middle section effectively is completely hidden from an end user's perspective, and it's really just the interaction of the sending and the receiving systems in terms of the folder structure that's used by the DTS client. So effectively in this case we would drop into the out folder a CDA document with a .dat extension, and we'd also put in there a CDA .control CTA file, which effectively would detail the construct of the control file. That construct, if it's using the ITK specifications, is detailed within the architecture specifications, which are published on TRUD. So part of the core part of the ITK specification set. So it's detailed within here. That those details can be found there. Going back to the sequence diagram, so the control file's been constructed as per the specification, dropped into the folder. The DTS client basically looks up and sees the intended recipient, and then sends it up to the central server, and the intended client will be polling and see that it's got a message for itself, and then that will appear in the inbox, and then basically the control file gets updated to tell it that it's been received. Infrastructure acknowledgement, if it's been requested, so this is now at the DE level, so it's outside of DTS itself. So you're actually looking at the distribution envelope that's being wrapped up, that's being passed in that .dat file, and processing the distribution envelope. You see that an infrastructure ACK has been requested. It's effectively the reverse of that process, that it would be sent back across the DTS system. The infrastructure ACK wrapped in a DE would be placed in the out folder along with the corresponding control file, and it would be sent across to the intended recipient. Again, if a business acknowledgement's been requested, it's an identical process. Again, a DE wrapped business acknowledgement, as I previously described, would be created, and just an extension of a .dat added to it, and a business act control file would also be created, and it would be sent to the intended recipient. And again, once the distribution envelope has been processed by the original CDA sender, it could very well be that system has requested an infrastructure ACK just to know that the distribution envelope has been correctly passed, and it could acknowledge back. So that's the sequence diagram in terms of the various DTS interactions. As I said, this middle part is completely hidden from an end user's perspective, and really it's just a case of dealing with the folder structure within the DTS clients, extracting the files as they come, and effectively processing the distribution envelope. So hopefully you'll be able to appreciate that regardless of DTS or web services, effectively the flow at the distribution envelope layer is identical, so it's completely decoupled from the transport mechanism. So as I said, just as a recap, the main description of the acknowledgement framework can be found within the ITK core, and the message examples can be found within the TKW, which is downloadable using the link that I previously showed. Okay, hopefully this screencast has been useful. Thank you.